Hello and welcome to Beyond Day Zero with me, Mark Day. Today I'm talking with Rob Hopkins. Rob is a guy who I admire his writing, and when I started out this podcast, honestly, he was somebody who one day I thought, well, maybe I'll eventually get to have a chat with Rob. Would really have liked to have done that. So I was delighted that when I got in touch with him, he said, yeah, let's have a chat. So, Rob is a co-founder and figurehead of the transition movement. You may have a transition town near you. You may be part of a transition network. He also has wrote a phenomenal book called From What Is to What If, Unleashing the Power of the Imagination to Create the Future We Want. And it looks, using what if questions, at all the things that are degrading and diminishing our capacity to imagine. And he looks into why our imagination is so vital for us as a species to be able to overcome and live well in the face of the challenges that we have ahead of us. So we really get into some of that. The hour absolutely flew by, and I know you're going to love this conversation. All right, have a listen and let me know what you think. Thank you officially for joining me. It's a pleasure to have you here, Rob.
My total pleasure. Thank you for inviting me. Nice to be here.
Yeah, perhaps you could just do a little intro. I'm going to sound like a right fanboy now, but I'm a huge fan of your book. Having read it only a few months ago, I often find myself quoting it to other people. I know parts of it that made a personal impact on me as well, but perhaps you could, I don't know, in a couple of minutes or so, perhaps you could explain.
Introduce the book.
Yeah.
So the book came around about 3-4 years ago when I found I kept reading people whose work I really admired on climate change, who kept saying climate change is a failure of the imagination. And that phrase sort of got under my skin somehow. And I was thinking, why are we having a failure of the imagination in 2021? And why is it a problem if we are? And so it sort of set me off on a kind of 2-year sort of voyage of discovery, really, to try and find out, what is imagination? Do we have a problem with our imagination at a time in history that really demands us to reimagine everything because our survival depends on it? Might it be that our imaginations just aren't quite up to the task? And if so, why? So the book is kind of an exploration of that, really. And it's written in 9, each chapter is a different what if question. So it explores some of the different factors that might be corroding and diminishing our imagination at the worst possible time for that to be happening, and what we might do about it. And it contains lots of examples of things that I found which felt like sort of best practice in terms of putting imagination back into people's lives. And it's made as more than 100 interviews that I did went into it, and all of those were published as I went along on the blog that I do, robhopkins.net, because that's kind of how I like to work. I guess fundamentally the idea of the book was, we recognize that if a population doesn't have a good enough diet, then you're going to see a rise of preventable illnesses. If you don't have a good enough education system, you're going to see a kind of a population that's unable to reach its full potential. But I felt like just over here, just slightly out of eye shot, our collective imagination is sort of shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and no one was talking about it.
Yeah.
I wanted to do with the book was to put it right back on the table, in the middle of the table, and say, look, this really matters. What happens to a population when its imagination erodes and decreases? And I think we're seeing what happens. We become far more gullible. We become far more malleable by people. We see we see many of the issues that we've had, which I think stem from people's inability to imagine the future in hopeful and positive ways. And so therefore, people step in and say, oh, that future looks a bit scary. I'll protect you from that. And you get the politics of nostalgia, and it's really, really dangerous. So it feels to me like putting the imagination back in the middle of the table is one of the most important things we need to be doing now. And that's really the case that the book tries to make.
Yeah, and it does it extremely well. And I've yeah, there are some, as I say, there were some areas in the book that naturally really spoke to me. So I'm gonna pick your brain even more about those things, because I think they're really good. All of it is really useful information. It kind of can stop you in your tracks, and I think really make you consider what's going on around you. And as you say, I'm absolutely convinced that a greater use of our imagination, developing as a society a greater imaginations together, is going to be absolutely vital. It really did speak to me. One of the things that's quite close to my heart, I've worked in conservation before. We're involved locally in a rewilding project. We've got a little bit of land ourselves. But you mentioned the possibility of the lack of imagination being to blame for the our tolerance of biodiversity loss. That's something I'd quite like to have a chat with you about. You know, the fact that we don't, I, as a child, I'm sure you did, played out all the time in my local area, was often where my parents didn't want me to be, didn't know I was, but it was a huge part of how I grew up. And you get to know the world around you, and and there are games that you play because you don't take anything with you. And yeah, maybe you could talk about what you found out in that area a little bit.
Yeah, there were, I've written a few books before, and every one of them tended to have a section about climate change, which meant I had to go back and read all the climate science, which is a really fairly heartbreaking thing to do whenever you have to do it, really. But there were some sections in this book that were almost as sort of heartbreaking to research, and the decline of play in our society is really, really troubling and dangerous, I think. So we've seen a massive, massive decline from, what you were talking about, how, when we were kids, we could just go out all day, and play with our friends on the street, and, whether they were safe or not, we're starting to find out maybe safe as our parents might have thought it was in those days. But that kind of free sort of let's pretend kind of unstructured play, where a bunch of sticks can become the Death Star, or can become a rocket, or can become anything you want it to, is so fundamentally important to the well-being of kids growing up. And when there was a piece of research that I think I talk about in there, where in 1960 something, there was a shooting at a university in Texas. A guy, a former Marine, I think, climbed to the top of the tower and just picked people off with a gun. And afterwards, he was interviewed by a psychiatrist who found that he hadn't been allowed to play as a child. And so he went into prisons and interviewed loads of people who were in there for various different sort of multiple shooting things, and found that all of them had had this experience where they had been denied the right to play. That's not to say that everyone who is denied the right to play is going to become some sort of mass murderer, but it's interesting that all mass murderers were denied the right to play. And there's something psychologically really important in how it gives us the ability to kind of improvise and cooperate and resolve conflicts and figure out how to work with other people. And when all of our kids retreat indoors to tablets of either an electronic or a medicinal variety, we lose we lose so much. And in the book, I talk about I went to Bristol to visit a street where they did a thing called playing out, which is now done in 60 streets across Bristol and many other places as well, which makes it really easy for residents to close their street for set times so that kids can come out and play. And the most interesting thing there was talking to one of the dads who said to me, well, after 6 months, we realized that actually we all quite liked each other. That you got a sense that when the kids were out playing, that was also part of the thing that wove the adults together. So when all the kids retreat indoors, all of those connections all break down. But the point that I try and make in the book as well is that that play should not just be something for kids, that we need to be bringing more play into our activism, into our work. And I talk about different examples of that. Play is where we learn to explore possibilities and kind of to make mistakes, and it's fundamentally important. And in the research that was done in 2010, that was the piece of research that I found that really set me off on this book, which said that our imagination and our IQ had risen till the mid-90s, and then IQ had kept rising and imagination had started to decline. I'm like, how come I didn't hear how come no one in the climate movement ever talked about this? Because it's really, really fundamentally important. And one of her 3 things that she said in that paper when she was trying to explain why this was going on was the decline of play. And it's one of those things that we absolutely ignore at our peril, and that we should make as many opportunities for play for adults, for kids, for everybody, because it's one of those, it's kind of like the air we breathe, really, I think.
It's really interesting when you have children of a certain age. So we have a baby, and we have a 4.5-year-old, or nearly 5-year-old. And it's amazing how, when you've got a child of that age, how you get sucked along to rediscover some of the elements of play that you kind of lost. However you are as an adult, be you someone who tends naturally towards that or not, you do a lot more of it when you have young children. And you think you're sometimes in situations where it can be a bit boring and stuffy as an adult, and you think, why don't we interact a bit more like we used to when we were children? Why isn't it more fun? It's noticeable when I've got children. The gap is noticeable, I think, and it'd be nicer sometimes, definitely, to just sniggering. We went out for a family meal the other day. It was through play, but our son got a pea stuck up his nose. It was quite entertaining.
I did that once when I was a kid.
But you were talking about you briefly touched on electronic devices, tablets, and that's the other thing that I think I don't like the fact that play has become, playing on a screen, because it's not really play. It's not play as in interacting with your peers properly, in my eyes, either. It's guided play. It's guided entertainment. That's what it is, isn't it? It's something else is doing the playing for you, and you're following it without that interaction with the world. I think it very much closes things down for us. And technology obviously has its purpose. And I think you also talk about technology and how that generally can be stifling to our imagination and very distracting. And that's something that actually that was one of the things that my own experience of using tech, I notice how much of a distraction it is. I think you talk about when you've got a smartphone that does so many things, you might have it because it's useful to you, but if there's so much more on it, so many more things that it does, you pick it up and you end up getting distracted by something else. And I've had that experience recently, even though I've tried to cut down my own use of it, where I've actually gone on there for something and something's grabbed me before I've done the thing that I wanted to use it for.
It happens all the time. There's the story that I tell in there, which I use a lot when I do public talks, about inviting people to imagine they're in the Yellow House in Arles in France in 1888. And Van Gogh comes in with this beautiful bunch of sunflowers, and then he arranges them in a little vase on his table, and he sits back as the sunlight comes in through the window. And then he gets his smartphone out and thinks, I'll just check my Twitter and my Facebook and my Instagram. And 2 hours later, he's watching skateboarding videos. He can't even remember why he started watching them. It's like, if that had happened, he never would have painted those paintings. And what a loss that would be. And how many of the great ideas that we need now in history, how many of the great inventions, the great works of art and poetry that could define our time just never happen because we reach for the phone instead, which we are kind of evolutionarily unequipped to be able to resist. Those things are designed by people who value our attention far more than we do, and value literally financially to the second that you're on their particular platform. I read one guy, I can't remember his name now, James Williams maybe, who wrote this book where he said, if you bought a sat nav and you put it in your car and you said, take me to Plymouth, and you ended up in Edinburgh, you'd take it back to the shop. You'd say, this is rubbish. I'm trying to go there and it's taking me here. But actually, that's what those things do all the time. We sit down to write an email, and an hour later, we're doing something completely different, and we completely forgotten that we even had to write those. We even had to write that email. The ability to be imaginative and to live an imaginative life is absolutely intertwined with our ability to sustain our attention spans. If our attention spans shrink and dwindle to the terrifying extent that they are now. I notice it with my kids. They rarely listen to a song to the end. Never mind having the patience to put on an album and play one whole side of an album.
Yeah.
30 minutes of music. They rarely get to the end of one song. They flick on to the next one. It's just like bing, bong, bing, sort of going from track to track. They know the first 2 minutes on a good day of lots of songs. They probably don't know how they end. And I think that then Nicholas Carr wrote a book called The Shallows, which is extraordinary, and a really seminal essay called Is Google Making Us Stupid?, where he talks about how our relationship to knowledge used to be, when there was a sufficient level of attention span there, that you could dive deep into knowledge and you could sustain your attention span. And that's where you get wisdom in a culture, when you can really read and digest and understand things. Nowadays, we just tend to kind of water ski across the top of that body of knowledge, and we lose the very sort of paradigm of depth out of our culture. And that's so dangerous, because it means we're much less able to discern when people are bullshitting us and when people are and fake news and so on and so on. So yeah, I feel like, you talked about your kids. There's the research there that really interested me was that I spoke to Marjorie Taylor, who does research with 3 to 5 year olds and has done for the last 30 years on how imaginative their kind of inner lives are. She says there's been no change. There's been no change between 3 and 5 year olds, but something happens when they hit 5 or 6, which is school. And school, and then also screens become much more prevalent in their lives, I think. And I had a really interesting thing yesterday. I was on a panel as part of a conference organized by Ubisoft, who are one of the biggest computer games manufacturer in the world, who I had to say to them at the beginning, I'm not sure I'm the right person for this. The last computer game that I played with any level of commitment was Pac-Man. So I'm not sure I'm quite your kind of audience, really. But it was about how computer games can tell stories for sustainability. How can people play games that get them more involved in addressing the climate emergency? And I said, well, when I was a kid, there was a TV program which I used to love called Why Don't You, which you might remember, which was basically this great, really punky soundtrack song that went, why don't you switch off telly and do something else less boring instead? And the whole program was about other things you could do apart from watching telly. It was brilliant. I said, because the thing is, with computer games, during a climate and ecological emergency where we have the tiniest of windows in which to avoid going above 1.5 degrees, which in itself is already catastrophic. Do we really want people to be sitting inside playing computer games, even if we're trying to get them to play nice computer games about making the world better? We want them outside planting trees
Yeah.
and tarmac and insulating people's houses. And, how do we, if you design a game that you get to the end of that game and you're like, where's my spade?
Yeah.
That's really good. But there's an inbuilt dichotomy, which is if you're a computer games company, you want to give as much of their attention as possible to your computer game. You don't want to design a computer game that makes everybody give up playing computer games. So it was a really interesting sort of conversation that we had.
Yeah. Did that go down well then?
Well, what was interesting was one of the other woman who was on it, who's from Ubisoft's sort of game design team, is really, really into permaculture.
Okay.
So we were saying, you look at a game like Assassin's Creed, which I've never played, but I read about in the paper, where they did a version of Assassin's Creed that was set in ancient Egypt, and they worked with historians to create the most historically accurate version of ancient Egypt that you could then run around as an immersive thing. It's incredible. Imagine if they did like a whole game set in a like a permacultured version of Paris, and your role wasn't to assassinate as many people as possible, but was to, I don't know, maximize the food production and biodiversity from the city or something. I don't know. As I said, chasing ghosts around a maze is about my level, really. Yeah, really interesting conversation though, and really good that they're having those kind of conversations, I think.
It is. I guess I can't imagine how, that's a funny phrase to say to you. I can't imagine how I was going to say how a games company would take such a leap of faith, to do something like you were suggesting, when they're going to have somebody going, well, it's all about the bottom line at the end of the day, but
I think there are some pretty brilliant people. I mean, there are some amazing, they talked about some of the games that because it takes a long time to develop a game like that. So some of the games that are in the pipeline are not about dashing about slaughtering things. They're really kind of about building worlds and sort of really imaginative sort of spaces, and you can do all sorts of different things. And I mean, it's like anything, isn't it? How do we, it's what all of this comes down to, is how do we make a low carbon future and what it will entail normal. So, we need to, if you play FIFA, for example, there shouldn't be any adverts for cars and petrochemical companies around the side of the football pitch. There shouldn't be product placement for crappy things, and it should be that everywhere you go, there's gardens and, that all of that stuff and renewable energy everywhere. So it's about making stuff normal, I think. But then it's also about making a different kind of a future irresistible somehow. It's about cultivating longing, which is what the book is about fundamentally. How do you cultivate longing for a different future? And that's the work of art and music and animation and storytelling and poetry and all that kind of thing, not dry academic reports.
Yeah, definitely. I wrote that down. I'll come back to that in a minute because it links into something else I was going to say. I was going to touch on education, which we did. You did mention about, when children's imagination is abundant until they sort of reach school age. And I don't want to be critical of anyone's choices in particular, but our family, guided by my wife, I must say, we decided to home educate our children. So our son, who would have now gone to school this term, hasn't. And that's the path that we're gonna follow, and I hope I think it will benefit him. I mean, teachers are obviously really wonderful, passionate people, but the school systems are so governed by outside agencies testing teachers, testing schools. I'm sure there's all sorts of crossovers between those testing that goes on, and it's really sort of opened my eyes to the fact that, and I just didn't see it a few years ago. I don't think that, the school system and the output of a school system seems to me to be there to meet the economic needs of the country, to shoehorn people into whatever the right jobs are that the country's economy needs. And that in itself ignores each individual's child's inbuilt talents and stifles their creativity. And and I can also see how that leads to children sometimes being out, some children that might be sort of outliers on in the school system and becoming identified as being problem children, because they're just not suited to what's going on in schools these days. And I think we're getting more problems. The more it tightens, the more the curriculum tightens and does away with creativity and arts and drama. And I just think it's getting worse. Is that how you saw it yourself?
I find it really, really troubling. Something like 20% of the economy of this country is what's called the creative industries. So film, music, design, and so on, which is way bigger than car manufacturing, airplane manufacturing, shipbuilding, all of that put together. So it's vital to the national economy. But there is a massive question of privilege here. Because if your kids go to a private schools have amazing art rooms, they have amazing theatre, creative writing. They recognize that part of creating sort of rounded people is to have all of that stuff as central to the experience. If you go to state schools are cutting the arts out at a terrifying pace. 90% of schools by 2025 want to be doing English baccalaureate exam curriculum, which has no arts stuff in it at all. And so when it's such a vital part of our economy and our national life, why would we be devaluing it to that extent? And why would you want to create an education system that makes no space for creativity and imagination? It's awful. And it all just becomes about making sure at least you get a grade C in English and maths and in science, and the kind of poverty of imagination that many kids have in school now is just terrifying. And in some schools you've got 40% of kids being excluded from school. That should be an indicator that something's really wrong with that education system. And I'm not for a moment having a go at teachers. Like you say, teachers are extraordinary, passionate people who go into this for all the right reasons. The problem is the system, and Michael Gove was very responsible for a lot of that. The thing that's really sad is, this stuff kind of goes round and round. And when Tony Blair was first elected, he hired Sir Ken Robinson to write a report for him, which you can still find online, which was his setting out how to reimagine the education system so that it focused around creativity and imagination. And it's brilliant. And you can still find it, and it just got put on a shelf and gathered dust and was never ever implemented. And at a time when we see, when so many of the things that our survival depends on our ability to imagine things, to see things as if they could be otherwise, to coin my favorite definition of imagination. If we have an education system that doesn't do that, it's such a massive failure. And I do a podcast called From What If to What Next, which I can say a bit more about at the end. But we did one recently about what if young people redesigned the education system, with these two phenomenal young people who were so smart and so clued up on gender and sexuality and race and intersectionality and colonialism and all the stuff that actually we never talked about when we were in school. And
We're trying to catch up on
sorry,
the stuff that we're now trying to catch up on.
the stuff that we're trying to catch up on, because our education didn't give it to us, and they were so amazing in terms of how they should be taught, and we should be taught with projects, not by subject, and we should have workshops in school, and we should be able to have a creative education. And the current system might serve a handful of kids who get loads of A stars and go on to Oxford, but it's failing way, way, way more kids than that. And it needs. In the podcast, I do an extra thing called the Ministry of Imagination, where I ask the guests to suggest 3 policies they would do that would transform the world in the way that it needs to be transformed. And pretty much every time there's stuff about education, it needs to go back to the education system. Yeah. That's where I would absolutely start, is by just completely overhauling the education system, because it's not fit for the world that we're moving into. And kids are way smarter than anyone gives them credit for. And 2 of my kids went to a school near here, which is a democratic school, where the kids have the powers to hire teachers, sack teachers, change school rules. And it's a phenomenal kind of experience for them, which I think should really be universal. When the first school strikes happened, the Prime Minister of Australia said, "This is terrible. Our schools shouldn't be parliaments." And I thought, actually, that's exactly what they should be. Why are we so terrified of a system that actually treats kids as if they matter and as if their ideas actually matter?
Yeah, it could be better examples of parliaments than Parliament itself, no doubt.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But good luck with that. I mean, it's like homeschooling is something which can be an amazing sort of gift to the imagination. I think I know some of the kids that I know. I used to know a lot of people who homeschooled, and when it works well, I think it's an extraordinary experience for them.
Yeah. I hope it continues to be. Yeah. At the moment, it seems like a continuation of it's a continuation of our life. It's the first 4.5 years. It hasn't changed yet, but it does mean that we're following his interests. Quite a lot, and clearly there's no pressure, and he's largely not being told to sit down and be quiet either. Yeah, it was interesting because we kind of geared up how we live. So we've adjusted our sort of lifestyle quite a lot, and it accounts for the fact that we want to home educate. And my wife she's at home most of the time, and particularly at the moment anyway, because we've got a baby as well. But I also have a small business, and something else you talk about in the book. And I've talked about this since to people in my shop. I have a Whole Foods refill shop, and about how local economies work, and the difference that people choosing where they spend their money and choosing to support local businesses, how much of a difference that can make. It was one of the reasons why I decided to start this podcast, because I wanted to talk about things like this, because I know that we all have power when, in terms of, particularly in this case, talking about where we spend our money, we all have that choice to make with every single thing that we purchase, and it can make the difference between a business thriving, prospering, or failing completely. And I was aware that there was something more to this to do with local economies, and I hadn't considered it to the extent that you describe it in your book. But I thought it'd be really useful for people that listen to this to talk about the difference, and how you talk about how money stays in a local area.
Yeah, I mean, the analogy I like to use is there's a place near where I live on Dartmoor I really love. Beautiful, really wild forests, and you can walk in there for hours. It's amazing. And when I walk in that forest, I really see it as being like a as a beautiful analogy for the kind of economy that we need to create in terms of how a forest like that manages water. So from the moment the rain hits the top of the trees, its impact is slowed by the leaves. It's stored on the surface of the leaves. It travels down. The leaves turn it into a mist, which then lands on the ground. The soil is like a sponge. The water is held on the bark and the moss on the bark. In bigger forests, the water is then sort of cycled around in the forest. In the summer, the leaves are like a sort of a lake in the sky above our heads, and so the way that how is moved around and held within that system is really how we should be looking at how water operates in our town, how money moves within the economy of our towns and our cities. If a neoliberal economist designed a forest, you'd kind of put guttering around all the trees and all the water would be captured and sent off to a big tank owned by one person. And a forest is kind of gloriously democratic, and that water is just moved around very slowly. So in Preston, the city council in Preston, about 10 years ago, did a study where they tried to figure out where all the public money went in Preston. 750 million quid a year that's spent by the 7 biggest publicly funded organizations in the city: the universities, the hospital, the schools, etc., like fire brigade, police, whatever. They found that only 4% of that money was spent into the economy of Preston, and all the rest of it left. And that matters because if you spend money in a shop like yours, and I don't remember the exact figures, so this is slightly off the top of my head, but it's something like, if I spend £1 in your shop, it leads to about £2.70's worth of economic benefit to the town around. If I spent it in a big supermarket, it leads to about £1.40's worth of economic benefit to the area, because local businesses are more likely to pass it on to other local businesses, to other local traders. It's why we started the experiments in local currency, like the Totnes pound that we had here in Totnes for 11 years, and other things like the Brixton pound. There are many of them in France now, inspired by the models that we tried here. Because the idea with that is you can't take it anywhere else. If I have a Totnes pound, I go to Newton Abbot, it's just a piece of paper. So it can't go to the Cayman Islands. It can't go to Bermuda or Jersey. It can only stay here and make things happen here. So the more money we can lock up into a format that can only stay here is really important. And in Preston, what they've done is they've changed their approach so that more money stays locally. So if they want to do a big construction project, rather than just doing one tender, which only a big national company can come in and tender for, they break it down into smaller bits so that local companies can tender for it. If they're doing work on a housing estate, needs some work doing on it, they do what they call insourcing rather than outsourcing, where they figure out who already lives here, who could do this work, that we could give this work to. In Cleveland, in Ohio, they had a very, very similar problem, and they created what they called the evergreen co-ops, where they for the local hospitals, they created a co-op to do all the laundry, a co-op to grow and provide the food, and a co-op to provide the energy to the hospitals, which has led to a huge amount more work being created, more. It's what people call community wealth building. If you want to make a community wealthier, you could try the conventional approaches. We need to build a big shopping arcade and get Apple to come in and do an Apple store, and probably get Pizza Express or someone, I don't know. But the community wealth building approach says we need to be smarter about what we already have and make sure it circulates as many times as possible. And to me, that's kind of the great new economic idea of our time, really, actually. And it's what we try and do in transition, and taken to one of its kind of logical extents in a project that I'm involved with here in Totnes called Atmos Totnes, which is a very, very ambitious, maybe the most ambitious community-led development project in the country, where the community is trying to become its own developer on an 8-acre factory site to build 62 truly affordable homes, a hotel, a music venue, 7,000 square meters of new workspace. the beauty of that is that the model is that it borrows money over 25 years to pay for it. Every phase has rental income, which pays off the mortgage. So after 25 years, you've got a development like that, which is generating £2 or £3 million a year for the community to decide what it wants to do with.
Yeah.
If that had happened in your town 25 years ago, how different would now your community be approaching the end of COVID, we hope, the climate and ecological emergency, all of the challenges that we have, if we knew we had 3 million quid coming in a year? We could then borrow against that way more. We could solve our housing emergency as communities rather than expecting private developers to do it. It's one of those deeply transformative ideas that can unlock so much if we shift our thinking about how the economic model that underpins it all works.
Yeah, it is such a shift, isn't it? It's such a step away from how we've just the norm that we live with and have lived with for the last however many decades. Yeah, it's an inspiring vision of how it could be. But how far along is I've seen your mentions of that project. How far has Atmos got so far?
Well, it got a long way, and we worked with the landowner for a few years. We did a consultation in a town of 9,000 people that more than 4,000 people contributed to. We created a master plan based on what the town needs. We got planning permission using something called a community right to build order, which is a power given in the Localism Act, where we got planning permission through a referendum. We got 86% yes vote in a referendum. And then the last stage of the process was that we had to agree the sale of the site based on an independent valuation, which we got done. And then just as we were starting the process of negotiating the final contracts to buy it, Dairy Crest, who we had been dealing with all that time, a UK company, were bought by Saputo, a massive Canadian milk company in Saputo, UK. A new guy was then promoted to being the boss. And he, unbeknown to us, because we thought we were spending 7 months negotiating final contracts and final agreements, he made a deal behind the scenes to sell the whole site to his brother-in-law instead, in a way that breached all of the main company's ethics of standards they expect for how their staff work. And so we're currently in an almighty battle to try and get the Canadian company to put the situation right, or for our local council to step in and do a compulsory purchase and to buy the site back. Okay. Very tiresome, because we should be building by now.
Yeah.
In a town with a housing emergency, there would maybe even be some people who would have a home already.
Yeah.
But that's not possible because of private interests and misbehavior.
No, I hope that gets sorted very soon and in the right way. Yeah. Yeah.
And actually, coming back to what we were talking about earlier, I think a lot of it boiled down to the fact that the guy in charge and some people, I presume, around him just could not imagine that a community could become a housing developer. I think they got to a stage where they thought, nah, that doesn't happen. Let's sell it to some people who vaguely have some possible knowledge about actual conventional development approaches. So it's that, and there are so many things where that happens, where great ideas just come up against people in positions of power and influence who just go, nah, that kind of thing doesn't happen. And it's toxic, and it's so kind of all pervasive.
Yeah. And maybe, it's a good example of the power of community. We often sort of look at what we can do individually, and we then abstract that upwards and look at the governments to solve things for us. But there's the bit in the middle, communities, is something that, would you want to explain why our community is going to be the answer to a lot of the problems we face?
They're not the answer. I certainly don't want people listening to this to think that I'm sort of saying, right, we're a whisker away from runaway climate change, and it's all over to you now. Because that's absolutely not the case. This is something that needs The solutions need to come from everywhere. And Extinction Rebellion are absolutely right when they say this is about systems change. This is not about fiddling around the edges and, changing our washing up liquid, although I'm not saying people shouldn't do that, but it's like so many of the things get batted back to us as like, well, it's your choices that you make. It's like, no. We don't get to decide whether Shell and BP operate in the way that they do. We don't get to influence that, apart from the choices that we make in terms of where we bank, but actually the banking sector is driving a lot of this, the pensions companies, government policy. This needs systems change, and that has to come from government. It can only come from there. There's stuff that local government can do, and there are examples in the book, like in Preston, about local councils, local governments taking much more bold and ambitious kind of approaches. There's all the things that businesses need to do to totally transform their approaches, universities, schools, individuals. It comes from everywhere. But I've always felt that there is a bit in the middle, which is the bit that communities can do, which is really, really important. So, what can we do with the people in our town, the people in our neighborhoods, the people on our street even? What could we create that government would never think of? Local government wouldn't have the headspace to even think of or get their head around. We can do that. So community energy companies, in Bristol and Bath, the community have created energy companies that have raised 13-14 million pounds worth of investment from the people in that city for renewable energy projects all across that place. No one else was going to do that. The story in the book about how the city of Liège in Belgium are completely reimagining their food system as a bottom-up thing started by the community through a really well facilitated process. They now employ hundreds of people, 27 new cooperatives. They've raised 5 million euros of investment from local people, not from the banks. The mayor of the city said to me, yeah, we used to say we want to be a smart city. Now we want to be a transition city. This is the future. And our job is just to help remove all the blockages to that happening. That's beautiful. And and so communities, and I see it again and again. I don't fly, so I only get to visit transition groups across Europe and in the UK, but I see again and again and again, the ideas that they have, the things that they set up are just, are something that could only come from that level, and particularly at a time when we're experiencing in this country an epidemic of loneliness. How do we have solutions to climate change which bring communities closer together and give us a reason to talk to each other in the same way that the kids playing in the street did? So there's an expression that we talk about in the transition movement, something like, if we wait for governments, if we try and solve this as individuals, it'll be too little. If we wait for governments, it'll be too late. But if we work together with the people around us, it might just be enough, and it might just be in time. And that's what I've given the last 13 years of my life to try to do.
Yeah. A couple of things we mentioned earlier on relate to something I was going to talk about. And you mentioned Extinction Rebellion. You mentioned play and activism and cultivating longing. And in terms of, I've been involved with Extinction Rebellion for, I don't know, it's a couple of years at least. And, I see, the messages that XR put out are absolutely vital and have shifted the conversation, certainly in sounding the alarm. And when you go along to one of the bigger events, the atmosphere, the relationships between people, the love that's really expressed between people, I've not experienced anything like it in a group of people before. I had a particular personal example of something when I was in London on a protest, and it was one of the times, I think it was the October, it's hard to play, October 2019, when the police were starting to clear sites that XR had held. And it was really weird. I had an unexpected kind of emotional reaction to having my bag confiscated. And I got it back with my stuff in it, but it left me feeling really edgy. And I went along to one of the workshops they were doing where it's just such a warm and open atmosphere. And someone gave me a hug, a stranger gave me a hug. And it was just like what I needed at the time. And but the well-being, regenerative culture, the creativity of some of the activism, some of the protests that happen is brilliant. And it's a real counter to the dystopian future messages that you mentioned earlier. I think it's great, and I don't think we do it enough in XR. I get why we have to tell the bad news, but I don't think we're very good at offering the alternative view of the world, what the future could look like. Because I think that would be, I personally think that like once you've deeply understood the reality of climate change, that you're not going to forget it, and continuing to allow yourself to be exposed to the hard facts and the dystopian future messages is counterproductive. And I think we definitely need more people to come together and create alternative visions of the future through play, through art, through the culture that we create when we come together as small communities. Yeah. I think that's going to be more engaging in helping people come together to work on the big problems, because I think the alternative can switch people off and make us hide.
I think Extinction Rebellion, and my wife is super involved in Extinction Rebellion. In fact, she's in the next room on an Extinction Rebellion meeting.
Okay.
In Glasgow. I think a lot of what Extinction Rebellion has done has been extraordinarily playful, actually, and imaginative. And the pink table and the pink boat and the turning Waterloo Bridge into a forest for 2 weeks, and some of that stuff I think Extinction Rebellion does incredibly well, just creating different spaces. And I was up for some of the rebellion, the last one, whenever it was, a couple of months ago, September, October, which they called the Impossible Rebellion, and it was all built around demand the impossible, and opening up those conversations about what's impossible, what is not, all of that they do that beautifully, I think. But and I know that the book has had quite an impact on a lot of people within XR, or who are involved in XR, who found it really, that thing of, we need to talk about the possibility. You can talk about extinction and despair to a certain point, but also you need to give people something to hold on to.
It's exactly that. Yeah.
And Extinction Rebellion have always had that thing of, it's not for us to say we're just pointing out the problem, and it's for other people to say what should happen through citizens' assemblies. But I think as well, there's a huge role for talking about what we should be doing. So when I went up, I was up there when there was the stuff outside the Science Museum and inside the Science Museum, who take huge amount of money from Shell, I think it is, or BP or someone towards the exhibitions that they're doing. And that was what I talked about was imagine this street in 2030. Let's do a bit of time travel now. Imagine what if Extinction Rebellion was actually successful, because so many people get involved in activism and they don't fundamentally allow themselves to believe it's ever actually going to work. So we have an experience in our kind of protest culture of going along and protesting stuff, but we never win anything. I mean, until I was involved in a project in my town where we campaigned to stop Costa Coffee opening. We're one of the only towns that has managed to keep Costa Coffee out. When they actually announced they weren't coming, I remember that moment of us all sitting there going, "Wow, this feels weird. I'm not used to this. Everything I've ever campaigned about before I've lost. Iraq war, road protests, blah, 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 blah. Or you go along, you do your thing, you lose. That's how it is. But actually to say to people, what if Extinction Rebellion won? What if it was successful and its demands were adopted? And then what would this street be like in 2030 if that happened? You know, look around you here. What would it be like if this tarmac was all up and there was trees all down here and there was a cycle lane down there and there was a place for kids to play over there and it was full of birds? You know, we could do that. But if as Walida Imarisha, who's an amazing black activist and writer, she says, we cannot build what we cannot imagine. And the poet Rilke once said something like, I don't remember the exact wording, but something like, the future must enter into you a long time before it happens, which is so beautiful. I just loved that. So how does our activism make that possible? How do you go on an Extinction Rebellion action and know that firstly, it's been successful, you know, you've had the influence on government that is required, but also how do you go home from it and look at the place you've come from through fresh eyes, rather than going home and sort of weeping into your pillow for the next 3 months because all everybody talked about was extinction. And that's not to, you know, I don't want to, you know, in any way make light of that. And the Extinction Rebellion have done is a phenomenal thing of opening up those conversation spaces. But in the same way that it's like with youth strikes, if we just have thousands, hundreds of thousands of young people facing the reality of extinction like that, and going out and taking days off school to march, and then nothing changing, we really run a risk of creating a very disillusioned, cynical generation. And so for me, I always said when the school strikes were really flourishing, there should be like 2 big school strikes, and then the third one, they all go out and do something. So they've got something to point to in 5 years' time and say, see that that forest up on the hillside? We did that as part of the school strikes, you know. So there's something tangible, and I think there's something about you know, over lockdown I did quite a lot of workshops online for different Extinction Rebellion groups around the country about the book, and for transition groups, and it was really interesting how the transition groups were saying, maybe we need to be more like Extinction Rebellion groups. And Extinction Rebellion groups say, maybe we need to be more like transition groups.
Really?
Everyone's trying to figure this stuff out because it's complicated and it's not moving fast enough. You know, and what's the solution? Yeah, but there's that thing that XR do of holding spaces and doing big kind of art interventions and really playful things. I think they do that extraordinarily well. What I'd love to see would be to hold a space and then to create a kind of a pop-up tomorrow.
Yeah.
You know, if you could take a space people knew really well and then turn it into what it would be like, that would just be beautiful. But the police have got a bit smart to all that stuff now, and nothing is anywhere near, so they could do that. But maybe it doesn't have to happen in London. Maybe it happens in places where it's less expected.
Yeah. You're about to head up to Glasgow, aren't you, as well?
I am on Saturday, yeah.
Are you speaking up there, or are you going there as a activist, or a bit of both?
I don't know why I'm going, really. I'm going because I went to Paris and it was extraordinary. Just as a like, if you really care about this stuff and it really, you know, for me, it was like in Paris, it was like a sort of a 2-week climate change fringe festival. There was interesting stuff happening all the time and you met incredible people. And I can only go for the first week, but I'm going up because my wife's going up and she's going to be involved in stuff there for the whole 2 weeks. And I'm speaking at one thing on the 6th in the evening, but apart from that, I'm just going up just to see what happens, really. Yeah, I don't have any great expectations. I don't have any great expectations of what's going to happen either. But the one, like Paris, felt like a moment in history, and I wanted to be there to taste the air at it. And I feel like that about this as well.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, do you want to mention your podcast?
Yeah, I do a podcast for me. You should ask, Mark. Yeah. It was one of the things that came out of the book, and it was my first lockdown project when basically all my traveling around and doing things work sort of vanished overnight. I thought, oh, okay. And So the idea of it is that every episode is based around a different what if question, and it has two guests, so that rather than exploring a complex question or an issue in a kind of an adversarial, debatey kind of a way, it's more like we assume that has already happened, and then we walk around in the near future if that had happened. So rather than having a debate about universe-based income, for example, is it a good idea? Is it not a good idea? We imagine it's 2030 and we've had a universe-based income for 8 years, and it's like, well, what's it like? How has it changed things? So that we're just about to publish episode 40, and you can get it now on all good podcast whatevers. But if people want to get them the moment they're released, and also we do bonus episode for subscribers called the Ministry of Imagination, and other bits and bobs as well that people get sent, then people can subscribe at patreon.com/from what if to what next. And I think, if people have read the book and enjoyed the book, I always like to do my research in public. So when I was researching from what is to what if, all the interviews went up on the website as I was going along, and I would ask people what they thought of them and people's ideas and suggestions. And the podcast is really the next part of that. So if you enjoyed the book, then it's really a nice journey to kind of join me on creating the podcast.
It is. I personally recommend it. I think it's great. There's been some great episodes, and I haven't listened to them all. There was one I think you got quite a bit of feedback on recently. It was about what if activists did as much work on themselves as the effort. That was just. I think I'm going to have to listen to that another couple of times. It was one of those.
Yeah, there were a few of them that really deserve several listenings. There was that one, which was with Alistair McIntosh and Anthea Lawson. There was one that we did on what if we address the trauma that lies beneath the world's problems. That I've had to go and lie down in the field after, because my head was going to melt. Then we did one about what if young people reimagine the education system. There's one that actually, episode 40, which goes out Monday after next, is what if Afrofuturism could teach the world how to ask good what if questions, which is as a whole is just so interesting. We did one about what if the Black imagination was valued as it should be, which was amazing as well. Yeah, no, I made a very deliberate decision at the beginning that I didn't want to do any episodes with just two white male guests on, and so it's led to a really conscious, trying to hear from a diversity of voices, and it's been a really great journey for me in terms of coming across people and ideas that I hadn't come across before. I kind of feel like it's part of something that we should all be doing. Like all of us, particularly as white men, to be really using the kind of privilege that we have to give space to ideas and voices, and that's what I try to do with it very much.
Yeah, it is fantastic. Yeah, anybody listening to this, just get into it. It's really well worth a listen. Thank you for that hour of your time, Rob. I've really enjoyed it.
A pleasure. We could talk for hours, couldn't we?
I know. I had plenty more stuff I had written down that I could have chatted through with you, but I really appreciate you making the time.
Oh, my pleasure.
How good was that, eh? Really, really enjoyed that conversation. Rob's such a lovely, friendly, warm guy. It was a pleasure to talk to him, and as we said, could have just talked for another couple of hours easily. There'll be some links in the show notes to find out more about Rob's work, and if you want to get in touch with me and give me some feedback, that would be lovely. Whatever feedback it is, it'd be gratefully received. You can do that. Drop us an email, beyonddayzeropodcast@gmail.com, or follow the Instagram page, which is @beyonddayzeropodcast. Okay, see you for another episode really soon.